What's so gross about a grocer?
What does a pettifogger do?
And where does a gong farmer actually farm?
We'll cobble together the origins of cobbler and get the job done on this career-centric episode of Words Unravelled.
Welcome to another Words Unravelled. I'm Rob Watts from the YouTube channel RobWords.
And I'm Jess Zafarris, author of the etymology books Once Upon a Word and Words from Hell. And today it's career day on Words Unravelled, and we're looking forward to getting to work on some of these word origins. Aren't we, Rob? Where should we start with these?
Yeah, well, in this episode all about jobs, trades, professions, and crafts, let's just start off with what some of those words mean, I suppose, because job is a word that you really take for granted. It can be a word meaning your profession, but it can also just mean, a thing you've got to do, a job that you've got on. And it's actually that latter meaning that is the earlier one. It appears in the phrase, a job of work, which you'll sometimes occasionally hear people using. And in that respect, a job is essentially a measure. And it goes back to a word that specifically meant how much a horse could carry.
Like a cartload of something, right?
Exactly. It could be called a jobbit or a jobble, but there was this word job. And so when you have a job of work, it means you've got a cartload of work, effectively.
The OED and a couple other sources also connect it to the word gob, like a lump of something. So perhaps that's our cartload is a big lump of something that a horse can carry, anything in that shape, which, I especially associate with something gooey and gunky. It may not have meant something so viscous and globular as gob implies today, but it wasn't always considered like the most glamorous thing, like a job versus a profession. That sort of implication goes back a good way. Like in our old friend Sam Johnson, in his dictionary, he defines a job as a low, mean, lucrative, busy affair, or a peddling pity work, a piece of chance work. Granted, he does editorialize a bit and joke around a little in there. So the extent to which he meant it that way is up for debate. But either way, it didn't imply the same thing as your regular occupation until like the 1800s.
And actually, there is a term that's used, I don't even really know of it being used in Scotland, that relates to the idea of a job to something considerably filthier, something disgusting.
That's a recurring theme with these words, as a matter of fact.
It is, yeah. People might know that a jobby is, it's a turd north of the border, as people in England like to say when talking about Scotland. But we're not talking about those sorts of jobs.
Different kind of job.
Thank goodness. We're not. So you mentioned occupation, professions. There are terms that are considered generally a bit more. By the way, profession just comes from the idea of I suppose when you join a guild, you profess to some form of vow. So that's where profession comes from.
Just the same idea as like a profession of faith. But interestingly, in the 17th century, profession became a euphemism for prostitution, which we see in terms like the world's oldest profession today.
That's right. And then you've got crafts as well. Now, I think English is the only one of the Germanic languages where craft isn't used really to mean power, which it does in other languages. I suppose witchcraft is more of, having witchy powers. But yeah, craft used to just mean a power, but now it means a skill, effectively.
Occupation, since we mentioned that, is from a root meaning to grasp or to seize, which kind of makes sense in terms of like military occupation, but sounds a little more dire when it's applied to your career. Though you could more generously say that it's the idea of something that holds or grasps or seizes your attention as you do your work. But for a bit of time in the 17th century, occupy was also considered a rather rude word because people had started to use it once again as a euphemism for sex.
Okay, we've got a theme going here, haven't we? How does this work out when someone's doing a job, giving some sort of job? Yep, we're getting down into the filthy weeds once more. If I can bring us out of the weeds, perhaps we could tread onto a rather cleaner path. The word trade comes from exactly the same Old English verb as to tread, which I think is rather interesting. Yes, it's the path that you choose to tread in life is your trade.
Oh, I like that. I feel like I think we should elevate that a little bit more because to use one of those jargony business terms that we've discussed before, I don't know. I rather like that. I find it I don't know, comfier than some of these others. Another kind of comfy one is employ, which means like to be folded into something, essentially. Implicare in French is the same source as the word implication, meaning to enfold, involve, or unite someone or something.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I recently did a video about Shakespeare, and I discovered in there he was the first person to use the word employer to mean a person who employs another person. Before that, an employer was someone who used an object, who employed an object. Yeah. So from there, you get to employee, right? You can't be an employee unless there's an employer. So that's it's a few words that we can give Shakespeare a bit of credit for.
One more before we move on to more specifics is that the word work is from the same Proto-Indo-European root as words like right and wrought and even energy.
That's amazing.
Isn't it?
The same as energy.
Yes. Ergon is also from the same root ultimately, which also means to work, which we've talked about, I believe, on our periodic table episode.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I remember that now. I remember that. And rights. Okay, so now let's get into some specifics. But right is a word that goes way back in English to Old English. It seems like everyone's job was some form of right back in the Anglo-Saxon times. Like you're either a wright or a smith, it seems. Can you tell us about what right means and maybe some rights?
Correct my pronunciation here if I'm incorrect, but the Old English word for right was virta, right? Something like that.
Yeah, it's along those. Yeah, it's a difficult one to pronounce. Yeah, but it's a lot of consonants piled up together. But that's how I'd have pronounced it as well.
So we had a bunch of these. We had a stanwirta, a stonewright or a mason. We've talked about this one before, the tree writer, which was a tree wright or a carpenter. A potter was a krockwirta, a crockwright. There was also a morderwirta, which was a word for a murderer, a murder right. Not a job per se, but something that defines you.
And then you just have a lot of people whose surname is Wright as well. Right. Damn right. Much like Smith as well. And you could have all kinds of Smith in English in the past. You could also have had, so it's across the Germanic languages, you have Smiths or Schmidt or Smither. And one of my favorite ones is an Icelandic word, which is a ljóðsmiður, which is a poet or a songsmith.
Oh, that's lovely. Okay, so the term, did you know that the term playwright was actually kind of like considered to be a joke originally? Ben Jonson was one of the first ones to use this, the playwright, 17th century playwright. He kind of meant it as a joke. Like he was like, this is my craft, and was poking fun at the connection to like more manual wrights and smiths and things. You've got your millwrights and wheelwrights and shipwrights and plowrights and things, but he was considering himself a word wright, and he didn't mean it in necessarily a like poetic and noble way, but in like look at me, I make stuff with words.
A bit like if one were to call oneself a wordsmith, one would sound somewhat pretentious, right? It's deliberately disparate from what it actually is, right? It sounds like something very hands-on. I mean, I suppose you do need your hands, but you're not getting them dirty.
Occasionally guilty is charged when it comes to selling various word writing services.
You are a wordsmith, Jess. You are a wordsmith.
I mean, I'll also take that it's a little pretentious. I don't mind bearing the burden of that one. Before we move on from Smith, we haven't quite discussed the idea that the reason we have so many different kinds of smiths is because the word smith meant originally is from a Germanic root, simply meaning skilled worker. So you weren't specifically working with metal originally, but any kind of manual arts or artisan work. And
if you're working with heavy metals, you were a blacksmith. If you're working with gold, you're a goldsmith, silver, a silversmith.
And then, of course, once, Latin started having a little more influence over jobs, we got, more specifics like farrier, an iron worker, which we also discussed, I believe, on our periodic table podcast.
So they're named after the iron that's part of their job. But do they specifically make horseshoes?
Yes,
Or am I confusing them with something else?
No, you're completely right. That was what they were specifically known for. I kind of wonder the extent. It seems like iron worker in general was the job, but often it was largely horseshoes because there was such a need for them.
I see. I've got all this other stuff on, but everyone just wants shoes for their horse.
Right, exactly. I mean, it was just there. So many people had horses and so many people used them for work that horseshoes were a frequent need. I'm sure you can get any. Of them. Yeah. Right. I'm sure you can get any number. I'm certain you can get any number of things at a tire shop, but you go there for tires, right?
We talked about our favorite form of right as well, the tree right, the trailwirter.
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah, it's really good, which has been replaced by the word carpenter, right? Right.
And carpenter is from a Latin word for a cart, right? Or a carriage, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, which I think will surprise people that the original carpenters made carts. They made carriages, not just any old wooden object. And you find that with quite a lot of job names, that they've gone from being something very, very specific to being something extremely broad. I'll tell you my favorite one of those. It's butcher, because butcher comes from the French bock, meaning goat. And originally they only sold goat meat. Now, obviously, they sell actually just about anything but goat meat around here. Anyway, and yeah, but you see that word bock in our word buck, but you also see it in like a springbok or whatever. It's spelled with a K in Afrikaans and Dutch, and a C in Old French. But yeah, the boucher was just a seller of goat meat.
I do wonder to the extent to which the more specific terms were their primary, much like the farrier, their primary thing that they sold, but at the same time they did a bunch of other stuff. And that's the case with words like barber, which means bearder. As many people know, they were also responsible for a number of things that you might need done to your face or body. Like you could get a surgery, or you could get your teeth done or removed, or you could be bled if you weren't feeling very well, which is why we have that red barber's pole that looks like a bloody bandage.
Yeah, that's supposedly what it represents, right? A bloody bandage wrapped around a pole because of the sawbones inside. Sawbones, that's a good old-fashioned job title, which we'll get into some more of those a little bit later, I'm sure.
Another one that went a little more specific, went from kind of broad to specific, is grocer, because a grocer was originally someone who buys and sells in gross or in large quantities, and referred to like wholesale dealers. But that happened to be food many of the times. Grocery was extended to food items in the 16th century because they were often dealt in gross.
Grocery. So we have a greengrocer in England, and that's pretty much the only sort of grocer that we've got. We don't talk about groceries in the same. I mean, it's sort of. I think we did for a long time. We don't talk about it as commonly as the word is used in American English. I know that much. We're much more likely to just talk about doing our shopping than
right.
Going out for groceries.
Right. I specifically go to the and we pronounce it the grocery store,
Grocery. I mean, we understand the word. And I seem to remember seeing the word groceries on the occasional sign, but we definitely don't talk about it as quite as often as you guys do over there in the United States. One
interesting connection here is that this idea of buying things in gross could also imply something like simple or coarse components. The sense of buying like simple meal components or things to make something else if you were buying non-food items in gross. And that also gave us the kind of ew sense of gross, which is like something simple or coarse or basic, and therefore also like, and we also have gross as an intensifier, which is from like buying things in large bulk. Something like a gross misuse of something or other is egregious because it is compounded by its size or volume.
And that word means in various languages either fat or large, gross. Like in German, something that is big is groß, it's big. And someone who is fat in France or wide is gros. And these all come from that, grossarius, I think, was the Latin word for someone who, it was essentially a wholesaler, someone who bought in bulk.
May I briefly talk about the different endings we find on professions, like OR, ER, or AR?
Yeah, because I think we've touched on the stir ending ones, those sort of feminine ones like the Baxter, the Webster, the Brewster, the female equivalents of the baker, the Weber. Yeah, the Weaver.
Yeah, Weber, Webster, Brewer, Brewster, Whitester, Whiter.
But tell us a bit more about sort of ER and OR endings. I mean, why do we have those two different ones?
Right. They're very inconsistent, right? It doesn't get better if you like go into like origins. Like when as we know, when you describe professions and habitual activities, that these are these agent noun endings. So some end in ER and some end in OR, and a couple end in AR too. Generally speaking, and this is one of those, there are almost more exceptions than those that follow the rule. Agent nouns that come from Old English and other Germanic languages usually end in ER, like baker or hunter, and words that come from Latin sometimes take OR, like governor and conductor. But of course, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of exceptions, like chandler, that's a candle maker from the Latin candelarius, or the Germanic sailor, which was originally spelled Sailer, but was Latinized over time, perhaps to reflect and match tailor. And then there are words like laborer, which are Latin derived but conform to English standards.
Yeah, English standards is an oxymoron.
And then there are a few Latin-derived professions adapted directly from French with the IER ending, like chocolatier and sommelier, which was originally an officer who manages provisions, and then a word for a butler before it was narrowed to a wine steward, from a French word meaning pack.
So essentially, would it be the person that was serving you your wine, the sommelier? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And eventually it would be someone who would work for a very high-end family and have the prestigious job of managing your wine stores. The YER ending on lawyer and bowyer are also variations on that IER ending, which is from the Latin arius, essentially.
Right. Yeah, you can imagine how the Anglo-Norman, the French versions that found their way into English had variants that were spelt with either a Y or an I, because they were just writing them down how they thought they sounded. There was no standard way of writing that ending.
Of course, there's tons of variation. Like if you go back through some of the examples of each of these words that I've just said in like the OED's meaning and usage guide, you'll notice that it's all over the place. The spelling is make it up as you go.
Yeah, I mean, you've set about finding patterns, and God bless you. But it's it's a tricky task, isn't it? It really is.
There's one more. The word like bursar, for example, ends in AR. This is a college treasurer, and it's an Anglo-Latin word that was originally spelled with an ER in English, reverted back to the Latin spelling of the Latin base word bursa, which was a word for a bag or a purse, and you tack an R on.
I think it's interesting that the Latinate ones do seem somewhat more pretentious, right? An actor rather than an actor, someone who just does the action of acting. No, they're not an actor. They're not a bad actor, a good actor. They're an actor, for example. And then obviously you have other feminine endings like res, s as well, which have fallen out of fast. Yeah, tricks. That's a good one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When does tricks get used?
Well, the one that comes to mind immediately is like
dominatrix. Yeah. Right. I hope you were going to say that too.
I was. Yeah, but I was. But you hear it occasionally. I feel like aviatrix. I've heard a couple of times, which is a little whimsical, but like you know what it means.
That's a good one. So that to me suggests that is a Latin derived ending, given that an aviator is an aviator instead. Yeah. Although we're generally losing those feminine endings. There are some, I'm sure, that have stayed around, but no one talks about a comedienne anymore instead of a comedian. Although really recently, people did, for sure. And is actress still acceptable? I think it perhaps is in a lot
Certainly in the Academy when it comes to Oscars season.
Yeah, for as long as they are separating the awards out between men and women. And
theys and thems.
Yeah. Exactly.
A couple of if we could get into some of those professions that end in ERs and ORs and things, since we've done a few of them, I suppose a lot of these we can kind of slide back in time as we talk about these, because many of them are jobs that only a few people do anymore, because they're more craftsman oriented. And many actually. There are lots of words for people who fix shoes from the past.
Don't talk cobblers.
And cobblers still exist. It's just not nearly as common of a profession as it used to be.
I would still say I'm popping to the cobblers to get my shoe rehealed.
There must be more cobblers where you are, and I think this is
it just sound very sort of
there is a cobbler
quaint
in town, like one. Unfortunately, this is a result of like mass consumerism and the resulting fact that many people just throw away their shoes when they start to get old, or the shoes are made so cheaply that it's not worth healing them or fixing them.
People are just used to buying a new pair.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of like very nice pairs of leather shoes that I absolutely would take to a cobbler, but many of my shoes are not of that stature.
But the word cobbler itself is kind of a tricky one to pin down where it's come from. I saw one theory that it's from a French word coupler or coubler, which means to couple, which means to bring together, which is a good theory. But I couldn't find anywhere that was claiming any certainty on where the word cobbler comes from.
Yeah, the OED is a little all over the place on this one too. The idea with coupler would connect it to perhaps the word like cobble together, though it says, quote unquote, that's not tenable, but doesn't really explain why that connection isn't tenable. It's possible they reject it because like cobble isn't recorded as a word for like mending or patching until the late 15th century, but cobbler is found as early as the 14th century, and cobble is sometimes considered to be a back formation of cobbler.
Yeah, so we get a cobbler, and then we decide that what a cobbler does is cobbling.
But I mean, okay, so here's the other thing, though. I think that makes perfect sense because cobblestones are placed together to form a street, and that word is recorded as early as the 14th century. So I still like the cobble together theory, and though I'm sure the OED has its reasons for not liking it.
There's a dessert called a cobbler as well, which again I think is more common in the United States. But am I right in thinking it's a bit sort of like a crumble?
It is similar to a crumble. The topping is a little bit more of it's similar to what we would call a biscuit. It has sort of a different consistency, and it looks like a cobblestone road, which is why it has that name.
Okay. And then, as I already used during the course of this discussion, we have the term cobblers to mean nonsense, which is rhyming slang. The original term is cobblers' alls, and the rhyming word is balls, and it means bollocks. So I've taken the tone down again.
This was supposed to be a very PG rated episode, and we've gone into all manner of PG-13 rated categories.
We've had dominatrices. I'm assuming that is the plural of dominatrix. I'm not sure. No, we've had cobblers' alls.
There are many other words for people who make and fix shoes. One of them is Chaucer, interestingly, not particularly thought to be connected to Geoffrey, but maybe. And it was a term for a shoemaker from the French chaussier, so it's a Middle English term. Cordwainer was a leather worker named after cordovan, a special leather from Cordoba, Spain, a worker in Cordovan leather. A crispin was a shoemaker, a saint, who was the patron saint of shoemakers. And then, of course, a snob, which I think we have touched on the fact that a snob was a word for a shoemaker or a shoemaker's apprentice before it was a word for the snobs we know today.
I had no idea that there were so many terms for shoemaker. And that's before we've even mentioned that there's just shoemaker as well.
Right.
Or a shoesmith, which only exists as a surname now, but was a job at one point. You mentioned the cordwainer. I had no idea that was named after Cordoba. That's wonderful. But I'm going to use it as an excuse to talk about milliners, who are named after the city of Milan. In fact, the earliest usage of the word milliner in English just refer to people who are from Milan. And it's because Milan, being a ever fashionable center of textiles as well, a lot of the time the merchants that were selling people their fancy clothes were from Milan, and they were known as milliners. And a milliner originally sold all manner of clothing and maybe jewelry or manner of goods to adorn oneself with. But eventually it became a word that was more specific to just mean someone who trades in hats.
Ah, that's so interesting. I would have thought it had to do with like a textile mill. I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's funny that it isn't related to that. It just comes from Milan. And so hat maker. There's another word for that in the US that we don't use in England, but we do use in England, but we use it for a different job. And that's haberdasher. Mm-hmm. They trade in hats in American English, right?
Well, the amount of people who use that word regularly to refer to people who trade in hats, I would say is probably not many. But okay. A haberdasher originally sold like any small things, like small wares, right? Because a habertas was an Anglo-French word for like small stuff, like sewing supplies and clothing.
Well, yeah. For me, a haberdasher is still someone who sells bits and bobs for sewing and knitting and textiles and such, the pursuit thereof. But yeah, habertas. Yeah, so the source of that word is just a list of traded goods from many centuries ago that has habertas on it. And we don't actually know what habertas was. It might have been a type of cloth, or it might have just been a word a bit like sort of miscellaneous for miscellaneous goods. But it's assumed that that's where the idea of haberdashery comes from. You would have some sort of, I don't know, habertassier who would trade in these, whatever they are, these mysterious goods. And from there we get the haberdasher. But yeah, this gloriously fun word to say, the origin of it is a little bit murky.
I wonder if it's a little bit like a bits and bobser, if that's what the implication is it's stuff thus and such,
Yeah, exactly. Bits and bobs.
Another kind of cute one is I love the origin of tinker, because it is meant to imitate the tink of their tools on the metal things that they repaired.
That figures. I like that. Yeah, I think I kind of always imagined that was where it came from, just because when you think of a tinker, that's the sound that you're hearing. Tink, 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 tink.
Another profession that's a little bit, it still exists. Anyone who works in like winemaking or brewing or distilling would use a barrel and would be called, the person who made those barrels would be called a cooper, right? The coop part appears to be a Germanic word for like a cask or a tub or a vat, and is related to the word chicken coop, which was also a word for both casks and large baskets and things before it was narrowed to the place you keep your birds.
Oh, I'd never drawn the parallel between a chicken coop and a cooper. There you go. You might naturally accidentally do it, and you'd be right to do so. That's magical. We talked about Smiths and Wrights earlier, but another common surname that is also a job is tailor. Of course, and tailor is from French word meaning a cutter, tailleur. But in French, and you still can actually, you could have multiple types of tailleur. You had to point out what it was. So a tailor who worked with cloth would be called something like a tailleur de robe, which is a dress cutter. But you could also have a tailleur de pierre, which was a stonemason, a stone cutter, or even a sculptor. Or you could have a tailleur de bois, who was someone who, for whatever reason, was cutting bits of wood. But in French, if you say tailleur and you don't add any of those other things, they will make the same assumption as if you said tailor in English. But in English, we've only ever had tailor just meaning the person that works with cloth.
Oh, that's lovely. I didn't look this one up, and I should have, because my mom is a tailor for movies and TV shows.
Ah, well, here's a nice little fact for you. The word that tailor comes from in Latin also gives us in Italian tagliatelle, which is cut pasta.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
that's
tailored
lovely.
pasta. Delicious.
Would you like to talk about some jobs that don't exist anymore?
Oh, yes, I would. Actually, I've been looking up some of these myself. So let's absolutely, I've got some pretty disgusting ones. Actually, we'll save those because we've already had enough filth as it is. But we'll get around to them.
I'm always game for a little a little gutter talk.
Anyone who has read your book, Words from Hell, will know that full well, Jess.
I'm a very mature person who definitely doesn't have the sense of humor of an 8-year-old boy.
Absolutely not. So go on, give us some defunct jobs, some out-of-date trades.
I feel like I'm going to say some of these and you're like, oh, my friend is one of those, because
you think we're so backwards in Britain that we're all still doing these ancient jobs. We're all haberdashers and cobblers over there.
Well, okay, do you know a perruquier, for example?
I've never met a perruquier, but I can guess what they do. Because
I bet they exist. Yeah, to give us an idea.
Well, I say a peruke is a wig, so I would guess they do something with hair.
Particularly those big stylized wigs that you would see from several centuries ago. Especially a peruke or a periwig was also another word for one of these big elaborate, usually a big elaborate wig, but probably any kind of like wig that usually men and often many women would wear if they wanted their hair to look nicer or didn't have very much.
Periwig, that's fun, isn't it? That sounds like just sort of an atrocious English take on like the French word perruquier or something like that. But I wonder if that gives us the word wig, if it comes from periwig, or whether...
Let's find out, because I don't know.
Ooh, etymology in action.
It is. Wig is a shortening of periwig from the 1670s. I thought that word would be older and that wig would have come first.
Yeah, so did I. But I guess the fashion comes from France, so the word probably did as well.
I'm also learning that to sell someone a wig was to bewig them.
Excellent.
And the term, like, have you heard the term like to wig out, meaning to like sort of lose your mind, was from the earlier term dash my wig. Like if you're so mad you take your wig off and throw it at the ground.
Throw it on the ground. Oh, dash my wig. Oh, you know, he dashed his wig. He probably wigged out.
And another term for like a public fight or like a rumble was wigs on the green. Like people got so mad they all threw the wig down.
That's like handbags at 12, right? It's all right. Yeah. Handbags at dawn.
People still wear wigs today, and I wonder if people who regularly wear wigs, because a lot of people do, I wonder if they would still call their wig maker a perruquier, or if just they would simply go, I don't know, is there a wiggery?
Yeah, I don't know. Is there some sort of wiggy Amazon? Do tell us as well.
A frobisher is a person who polishes metal or maintains metal instruments like weapons or actual musical instruments. The name is a twist at furbishing something. It's a metathesis of furbish.
Okay. So would furbish be the right one and frobish be the sort of mistaken order of the lettering?
Yeah, so to speak, you might say that furbish is older. Forbis in French, or forbir, was a word for like polishing or burnishing or mending something.
I see. Forbier.
Nice. And of course we get that in the modern term, like refurbish as well. Another one with I guess maybe adjacent job would be a doffer.
A doffer?
Yeah. A doffer was a person who removes doffs, which is like bits and bobs and bobbins and spindles and things that would hold fiber like cotton or wool from a spinning frame and replace them with an empty one while somebody was hard at work keeping the thing going. And a carding machine also has an object called a doffer, which is like a comb or a revolving cylinder which doffs or strips off the cotton or wool from the cards.
So when one doffs one's cap, is that the idea of sort of...
That appears to be the case.
Stripping your cap off?
Doff your cap was a contraction of do off, like to take off.
To do off your cap, okay.
But I kind of wonder if doffer wasn't that too.
A do-offer?
Yeah.
You're a do-offer.
It doesn't say that here, but it could be.
I like that. Rather than, you're not an off-doer, you're a do-offer. It's, you can hear that sort of, you can imagine the thought process where that comes out in quite a sort of casual fashion.
Another kind of silly sounding one is a bodger, a skilled woodworker who made chairs and small furniture parts. Bodging was apparently a variation on the word botch, or is at least related to it, because a botch was a word meaning to repair a worn or damaged item, but specifically to do it kind of badly. So you botch the job.
Which is what we would call a bodge job now. You know, if you bodge something, you sort of just throw it together. You don't necessarily botch it, but you certainly bodge it. So I said I was going to drag us down into the gutter, and I'm going to do that quite literally, because there is an old Victorian job, which was a tosher, who eked out a living by trawling, presumably ankle or knee deep, through the sewage of London in search of items that they could salvage and then sell. And to this day, we sometimes talk about something being tosh as being nonsense, as being cobbler's awls even. And that is thought to probably come from this idea of the tosher and the sort of things that they were pulling out of the sewers or the gutters and trying to flog.
There are a lot of fun words for like either undesirable or irreputable jobs, or both. Another one is a screever, which is kind of an early graffiti artist, a street artist who made temporary chalk drawings on sidewalks, was called a screever. Screeve as a verb was specifically found in the verb phrase to screeve a fakement, or to write a letter or document used by like a swindler to try to deceive others into giving them money.
That word must be related to scribe and écrivain, the French for a writer.
It's supposed to, I think, be a kind of jarring variation of like a scrivener or something.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you ever heard of a gong farmer?
I have, but tell me about it.
Gong is an Old English word, or from an Old English word, ganga, which meant a passageway, but it also meant, euphemistically, a latrine. So Oof. A gong farmer was someone who was responsible for keeping the latrines of castles tidy and clean. And actually that term goes right back to when the Normans invaded. And of course, it's the Normans who built the first castles in England. And and so are born the gong farmers.
The all-purpose version of that job would be a night soil collector, right?
Ugh. Night
Terrible
soil.
job.
Oh, well, we've
right
all
out of the
experienced
gutter.
the occasional night soil, haven't we? Another highly undesirable job was a sin eater. I don't know if you've heard of sin eaters. It sounds right up your street. But this is someone who would be hired to consume, quite literally, the sins of someone who'd recently died. And the process would usually involve the sin eater eating something like a piece of bread that had been passed over the top of the body of the corpse. And that piece of bread was somehow imbued with the sins, with the ill doings of the person who died. And they would therefore be absolved of those sins by the sin eater's actions. But the sin eater would in turn take on those sins as their own. So, I mean, imagine having a job that kind of requires you to damn yourself to hell every time. Actually, I think I've had jobs like that. I worked in the frozen aisle at Sainsbury's. It felt a bit like that. Yeah, that was a sin eater. No, yeah, that was a legit job. And until surprisingly recently, like the 17th or 18th century as well.
Feels like cheating, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those Catholic practices that the Protestants cited as being a sign of how far they'd gone from, the idea that you can just hire someone to absolve you of sins. It wasn't enough that you could just sign a piece of paper. You just hire someone. Oh, after you're dead, just get your family to hire it, and that'll be fine. You just wait at the pearly gates for a few minutes, because my wife's just hired someone to try and eat away my sins, and then we'll do the calculation, shall we? Yeah.
There's a fantastic book I've read recently. It's a novel, a horror comedy, you might say, called The Witch Stone, and the premise of that is heavily involved in sin eating. And I highly recommend that one if anyone's ever read it. It's not the debut of the author, but it's his first adult oriented novel, whereas other books are middle grade fiction. Cannot recommend it enough.
So I think we can accept that a tosher, a gong farmer, and a sin eater are undesirable jobs. But I have found during research for this episode what I think is my ideal job, and unfortunately no longer exists. It's called an ale conner. And this is someone who was hired by a local authority or by a court to routinely test the strength of a district's beer.
Oh, darn.
Yeah, so their job
Hate
would be
that
to go
for them.
Yeah, exactly. They would just go to ale houses, have a sip and go, was very... I don't know what it was for. I don't know if they were taxing the beer by alcohol or whether it was purely to try and keep a control of people's behavior and to, to just make sure that the beer people were consuming wasn't too strong. But yeah, the ale conner, that was their job. And conner is from an old English word meaning a tester, which we don't have anymore.
So unrelated to like confidence and confidence artist, like con artist.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's quite the opposite, actually. Well, actually, now you've got me thinking. I wonder if con...
I mean, I would assume it's older than that. Confidence artist is a relatively new term compared to a lot of the ones we're talking about.
So a con man is just... The con in that is just short for confidence trickster or confidence.
Right, because you earn someone's confidence in order to swindle them out of money.
I've got you.
Speaking of questionable ethics and jobs, we had pettifoggers, right?
I've never heard of it. What do you mean?
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So pettifogger.
Yeah, a pettifogger is a term for a lawyer of questionable ethics. And petty here means small. Fogger here was a word for a schemer, or a huckster or a cheat. And it's probably from like a Dutch word meaning to cheat. But I kind of wonder if it also was influenced by the idea that they're sort of fogging up the truth, you might say, or obfuscating the truth. There was also a word, pettifactor from the 16th century, who was like sort of a public servant who would undertake smaller cases. So the same kind of like petty thing. So I wonder if pettifactor turned into pettifogger as sort of the pejorative variation.
Right. Oh, we didn't talk about barristers and lawyers much, did we? I mean, you mentioned lawyer in passing, but just a little extra fact: barrister and barista, etymologically, basically the same. They mean a person who works at the bar. The barrister has been called to the bar of justice, and the barista. Oh, by the way, barista. So yeah, they work at a bar where you get some coffee. That word doesn't appear in English, or at least I haven't found any written examples of that word in English before the 1980s.
That kind of makes sense now. It would have been like the boom of like large coffee retailers like the Starbuckses of the world who made that trendy and fun.
The earliest quote I could find that the Oxford English Dictionary had pulled out was from 1982, and it said, "A good barista can simultaneously keep an eye on the coffee oozing from the espresso machine into a battery of cups, pour vermouth and bitters, and discuss the miserable showing of the Lazio soccer team." So someone clearly writing about life in Rome there.
Right, because a barista was like a bartender before a coffee bartender specifically.
Yeah, I guess it was doing double duty.
Any mind-altering liquid, caffeinated or alcoholic.
That's it. Anything that's either going to give you a perk or, I suppose, bring you down again. I don't know.
Or both, if you like you also like your coffee martinis, right?
Can I give one more odd old job?
Sure.
I could really do with having one of these in my life. Nomenclator is a job that existed in Roman times. It was someone who was usually sort of running for office and trying to curry favor with the people they were meeting. And their job, nomenclator literally means name caller. And their job would be to remind their master of the names of the people that they met. And it's been used more recently, and sort of much more recently than Roman times, in English to mean someone who announces the names of people as they arrive at a gala, or it does just sort of subtly tell the host, the names of people. And I really need one of those. I can't keep just saying mate to people at parties because I can't remember their name anymore. I need a nomenclator.
To what extent is nomenclature connected? I mean, I'm assuming same roots and whatnot, but is there any influence in terms of usage?
No, it's just they're linked in terms of their etymology, because nomenclature means name calling and a nomenclator is a name
caller.
Yeah.
Lovely. Very nice. Very nice. One more of these the kind of silly sounding older terms is a loblolly boy.
Yeah. Now I did come across this one as well.
An assistant to a naval surgeon, but also perhaps someone who served loblolly, which is a sort of porridge, a thick gruel, and lob is probably the same kind we see in like blobs and lobs and spider shapes and bulbous things. Perhaps it's a lumpy soup or bubbling and boiling soup or something. There was also a lobscouse, which was a word for like a sailor's dish.
Yeah, well, actually, that's where the word scouser, the nickname for people from Liverpool, comes from. Is from lobscouse. And a loblolly could also be a ship's doctor. I mean, there are a few. It seems like loblolly boy was a more common term, but the loblolly could just be the doctor, which leads me onto a little list that I've compiled of old terms for physicians, because they're thought of, I think, with quite a great deal of respect these days. But in the past, doctors have been mostly treated with utter contempt. They've been seen as profiteers, and
interactions with doctors were probably quite painful and really gross prior to general anesthesia.
Yeah, and actually in some of these nicknames, you can hear the sorts of practices that they were getting up to and why why they weren't considered a particularly pleasant bunch. So you had obviously people know about the involvement of old doctors of old with leeches. So you had the leecher or the flesh leech. We also had the piss pot, who was someone who would attempt to try and diagnose someone by assessing their urine. There was a clyster pipe, which was just an unpleasant nickname, which I won't go too deeply into. A nimgimmer, which sounds fun, but is kind of more or less nonsense. There was a pillmonger, and I think there are a few people nowadays who you could quite rightly just describe as a pillmonger. Squirt, a doser, or, of course, a quack.
Mm-hmm. And doctor was a word for like an advisor or a religious teacher, well before it was a word for anyone who dealt in medicine. And it just means teacher in Latin.
Yeah, it's quite unusual that it has narrowed down to be specific. I mean, in terms of medical doctor, although we do obviously use it in incredibly vague sense when we talk about anyone who's got a PhD, for example.
You mentioned leech. Now, leech was a more common word than many of these for a doctor, and it's a partially unknown which one was called a leech first, a doctor or a leech, and whether these terms arose independently. Old English leech was as much a word for the bug, or the parasite, it's not a bug, as it was for a doctor. And it may have come from like the word for the physician may have come from a word for like a charmer or a conjurer of some kind. And leech itself as a word for the organism may have developed independently, or it may have been inspired by the fact that leech was a word for a doctor and doctors used leeches.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. So
little chicken egg situation, Dr. Leech.
Right. So when I say, they're calling them leeches because they use leeches, no. Potentially,
it was just a word
they're calling
for
the
a
leeches
physician.
leeches because they're used by leeches. Oh,
yeah,
my
and
goodness.
it has a bunch of cognates in other German languages too, for words for like counselors and respected professions.
Unbelievable.
And then one more word for a healthcare worker of old was a spitaler, which is short for hospital, interestingly enough. Which, of course, hospital wasn't necessarily always a word for a place where you could be healed. It could be, but it was also, it's related to words like hospitality and things like that. So a place that you might stay or a hostel. It is pretty interesting that like hostile and hospital and hospitality and hostage and hotel are all from the same root, meaning stranger, guest, or host. And some of those ended up pejorative and some of them ended up as like cozy places or places you're healed.
Yeah, some of them we really need and some of them you really want to avoid.
Right.
Although actually some of the ones we really need, you also need to really avoid, thinking of the hospital.
Right. I would generally speaking like to not be in one.
But a spitaler has nothing to do with spittle. That is good to know.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, hasn't it?
It has. Not at all hard work, I would say. Although I think we've definitely put in a bit of graft into this one.
We would love to hear more about some of your professions and any origins you might know of them, and perhaps we can dig into those on a future episode.
Thanks for watching or listening to another Words Unravelled.